Welcome everyone, Michael Scott, Scotty Man Photo. So what's the best focal length for landscape photography? That is an interesting question, and it's been asked a time or two on YouTube, that's for sure. And I've got a little bit different take on it. But we're going to have to dig deep into Lightroom and into our portfolios to really get the answer to the question. But I really think we're asking the wrong question. So what is the right question? Let's find out. So the right question is, what's the best focal length for your type of landscape photography? And I don't think landscape photography, it's a genre of photography, but I don't think that's just one landscape shooter shoots all landscapes. There's many subcategories, subgenres of landscape photography. For example, there's cityscapes, there's landscapes, there's seascapes, there's a variety of different types of landscape photography. And I think it's there in which you find the best focal length for your type of photography. But I think there's a way to do that. There's a way that we can go in, or at least most of us can if you've got enough data, and find out what the best lens is, or at least the lens that you use the most often. So we're going to get into that. So the metadata in Lightroom is extremely valuable, and I didn't really realize how valuable it was until I really started probing around. But you can find some interesting data in here, and some of the data can help us determine what lens we use most often, and even what lens we use most often in what situation. And so I've kind of used the science of this to determine the best focal length, at least in my type of landscape photography, which is more of the kind of natural world image. And I think I gravitate towards a scene that kind of tells a story. So, but more into that here in a moment. So in addition to providing some very useful data, Lightroom's an excellent photograph organizer. And you can basically organize your image in a variety of different ways. If you're not familiar with Lightroom, I would encourage you to take a look at it. And it's a very powerful tool. But so I use Lightroom, kind of the star system, to organize my images, or certainly my favorite images. So actually, when I'm viewing an image, and as I come across the image and I'm like, wow, okay, I really like this image, I try to rate it on a star system of 1 star to 5 stars. And that's if I like the image. If I don't like the image, I don't even give it a star. So long story short, that's what I do. I place stars on images, kind of like we did in grade school, right? I always liked those stars when I was in grade school on my papers. So I didn't get many of them, so and I'm not getting many of them now either. So, but anyway, nevertheless, I do have a few images that are 5-star images, or at least that's the way I feel about them. But that's irrelevant. But the stars, what that's allowed me to do is really kind of break down the data in Lightroom and determine not only what lens I use the most, but what focal length I'm actually using the most. So if you kind of take a look here, you can see that basically what I have is, on the star systems, I've broken this down into two different focal lengths, 14 to 24 and 24 to 70. So the big comparison between the 14 to 24 and 24 to 70, I have a lot more images that are starred. For example, I've got 157 1-star images on a 14-24, but the 24 to 70, I've got 143. Now that's not a big difference, but as it goes on, I've got quite a bit of difference on the 3, 4, and 5-star range. So the 4 stars on the 14 to 24, I've got 17 4-star images. On the 24 to 70, I have 6. And 5-star images on the 14 to 24, I've got 5. Now, with only 1 on the 24 to 70 range. So what I've really come up with by looking at that and going back and looking at those images and kind of studying those is, if I had to do some image triage here, which images would I get rid of? Well, of course I wouldn't get rid of any of them, but if I had to, it certainly wouldn't be the images from the 14 to 24. So those are my favorite images. Those are the images in which I've placed the higher ratings on. And that's pretty critical data for me to have to go back and analyze and realize. And I guess the takeaway for me is that what it's telling me is the 14 to 24 is not only the lens I use the most often, the focal range that I use the most often, but when I further break it down, my average focal length on the 14 to 24 on the 4 and 5 star images is 14 to 18 millimeters. So that's typically the focal range that I'm shooting in for the images that I hold in the highest regard. Now the 24 to 70, I've got several images in the 4 to 5 star range, and that focal length is 24 to 45. So I guess if you're really looking at the data, and for me, I guess I could say, well, if I had a lens that was 14 to 45, I'd have it all nailed. When I look at the 70 to 200, which I sometimes use, the data really tells me that I only have 2 3-star images, and I have no 4 and 5 star images. So I'm not shooting the 70 to 200 so much. So that's kind of what the data tells me, and I think that the takeaway is, for me, is that the focal length that I use most often is 14 to 18 millimeters. And so with that knowledge, if I'm going out to shoot, if I'm only going to take one lens, well, the data says I should take the 14 to 24. So, but anyway, I think I found that data interesting but helpful. So if you have this data available to you, you might go back and look at that. And certainly if you've been shooting a while, maybe you've been renting lenses or borrowing lenses, or you've just gotten started, if you have data available, I would encourage you to go and take a look at it. But you can certainly learn from other photographers too. Like for example, the data that I provided here and the type of landscape photography that I do might help you maybe get in the range of the focal length that you really might want to go out and start shooting with. So I guess if I could have a lens that had it all, it would be a 14 to 200, and it would be sharp, edge to edge, perfect image, and lightweight, small, all those things. But the truth is that, that's a fairy tale. It's a dream. That lens doesn't exist. And so what do I wind up with to get that focal range? That's the ideal focal range that I would want on any scene. And even some might want 14 to, or 10, even 10 to 500 or 10 to 1,000. So I don't think that you're going to make everyone happy regardless. But for me, I think as I mentioned, the 14 to 45 would be ideal. But I'd like to have a 14 to 200 if possible. But that's perfectly sharp and just a fantastic lens all the way around. But that's yet to be manufactured. So instead, what I have, at least for me as a Nikon shooter, is the Holy Trinity. Nikon's Holy Trinity is just 3 lenses that cover those focal lengths, and each lens by itself is a really good lens, sharp, pretty much corner or edge to edge. And these lenses are fantastic to take on any photo shoot that I do. But the problem is they're heavy. Their combined weight is pretty significant in anyone's bag. And I'm a good sized guy, but carrying all 3 of these lenses, if I can avoid it, I do try to avoid it. But at least looking in the data in Lightroom, there's a good chance that I'm going to use my 14 to 24. And there's a pretty good chance I'm going to use my 24 to 70, but not so much my 70 to 200. So at least the data helps me determine what lens to leave at home. And you can further decide what lens to bring based on the area that you're going to, and what kind of images you're expecting to capture in a certain area. There are a variety of lenses out there that cover a wide range of focal lengths. And the truth is that you can select those lenses and cover down on those focal lengths. I talked about that ideal 14 to 200 focal length that had perfect sharpness, that was the perfect weight and size. But the lens doesn't exist. So I wind up with the Holy Trinity to cover all those focal lengths, but with the sharpness that I want. And so, those are trade-offs. When you go with a lens that maybe covers a wider range, a wider focal length, you might have some edge quality loss, just overall image quality loss. So you just have to keep in mind that there are trade-offs. So when selecting a lens, it's not as easy as just selecting the focal length and calling it a day. You have to consider all the qualities of the lens that you want to capture your images with. Truly, it's the composition that really should drive you towards the lens. What type of photographer are you? What type of image are you trying to capture? And what's your style? Not the style of others, but what are you interested in? What kind of images do you want to capture? I think many times we end up scouring through Instagram or other social media sites and finding compositions that we think, wow, they're fantastic. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a great image. I love it. I want to go out there and reproduce that. But I would say this. When you're reviewing images or you're considering a photo shoot somewhere, what's your style? What do you want to capture? How do you want to compose the image? And I think that selecting a focal range, that's something that you have to keep in mind and take into consideration above everything else, is what style of photographer are you? What kind of images are you trying to capture? My preferred compositions, I would have to say, are more of the open vistas. I like to capture not just an image, but a story. And I think that, when I zoom in really on a 200 millimeter area of a big vista, I think it tells less of a story. I think you can still tell a story, but at least for me, I like a wider scene, a large vista. If I go to an area like Sam's Throne, I want to capture an image of Sam's Throne, and I want someone to look at that image and first and foremost and say, oh yeah, that's Sam's Throne. But I really want them to say, wow, that's the best Sam's Throne image I've ever seen. But, I think you have to maybe go there 500 times to make that happen, but I think you can make that happen. And certainly if you're going there with the right lens to capture the vision that you have, that image that you have in the mind's eye, take the tools that you need to go there to capture that. And that's, I think, how you select the right focal length. Well, it's always difficult to just recommend one lens, one focal range. But I would say this, though, if you have an idea of what kind of landscape photography you are, what kind of shooter, what kind of image are you looking to capture, then maybe you have a better idea of what focal range to select, what lens to pick. But if you have no idea and you're a new photographer, you're a new landscape photographer, just have no idea, you just want to get your camera, get out there in the natural world and take images, then I would recommend a 24-70. And I think that would be the go-to lens to really get you started and get you out there in the field, and then from there, you grow. Well, in summary, I would say don't put your lens selection above your composition. What type of photographer are you? What kind of landscapes are you interested in? And then use that to select the lens rather than just going out, selecting a focal range and then you just go out and shoot with it. But I think if you're new and you're just getting started and that's where you're at, then, as I mentioned earlier, maybe the 24-70 might be the way to go for you. For me, it's the 14-24. But I've used data to really know that. That's how I know that. And if you have that data, if you have data in Lightroom that you can use to determine what focal range to kind of determine for you, at least that's the best focal range for you, I think you should use that data. If you don't have the data, maybe you have a small collection of images available. And you could pull from those images, and if you can get the any of the metadata off those images, then I would encourage you to look at that. But if it's just your portfolio and just images that you have, you can kind of study your images and kind of look at what kind of photographer, what's your style. Try to identify your style, and then that might help you select whether a wide angle might be more appropriate for you, or maybe you're shooting with a telephoto lens and you're more in the 150 to 200 focal length range. And that might be the type of landscape photographer that you are, therefore the focal length that you really need. And so you can decide on, picking the best lens that way. And maybe you've been shooting with a crop sensor for a long time. It's something to keep in mind and not forget that you have to think about that 35 millimeter equivalent as a crop sensor shooter. And certainly if you're switching from crop to a full frame, you have to realize that the focal length is different. So when you're viewing a 50 millimeter on a crop sensor, you have to multiply that to get the 35 millimeter equivalent. You've got to multiply that focal length by your crop sensor crop factor. So usually for Canon, I think it's 1.6 and Nikon's 1.5. So you can see that the focal length is different on a crop than it is a full frame. Well, I would say that the focal length is the same, actual length on the lens, but it's the way the image is cast onto the sensor and changes the whole perspective. So something to keep in mind when you're trying to find the right focal length for you. Well, hopefully I was able to give you an idea what the best focal length is for landscape photography, or at least the right question was, the best focal length for your type of landscape photography. So I hope I was able to do that. But, if I wasn't, maybe you picked up a couple of tips that might be useful. I hope so anyway. But nevertheless, I'm going to end the video. But if you like the video, make sure you hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. And drop me a comment. Let me know what you thought. And as always, if I don't see you down the road, maybe I'll see you on the trail.